Welcome to the Xeno Podcast, where we aim to discover the ways that stories shape us in society and how we make sense of chaos and answer the fundamental questions of consciousness through narrative.
Now that's a mouthful, sounds like a lot, but where the title comes from, Xeno, is it's a prefix that means strange or foreign, and we always see that in stories, there's always a process of discovery that comes along with it. So making sense of the strange, making sense of chaos, trying to welcome new foreign ideas and strange concepts into our minds and trying to integrate that into our lives. And today, we'll be talking about how a certain type of story has helped people make sense of the chaos of the Civil War. Dr. Allred is one of our professors, and he's a Civil War scholar, enthusiast, and he has even participated in Civil War Reenactments. He is published on the subject in the Journal of American Culture, and we will be discussing some of the ideas in his articles. So, Dr. Allred, what got you interested in studying specifically reenactments?
Well, as you know, my training is in American literature, and I had interest in the way that literature intersects with history. Guy named Sir Philip Sidney, way back in 17th century, I think, wrote a treatise in defense of poesy where he talked about how literature really can get closer to telling the truth about human life than history can, and proposed the idea that has been juggled around ever since then, that history and literature are really just two kinds of narrative, and one isn't essentially any more true or authentic than the other. So one of my colleagues suggested, well, you've been involved in Civil War battle reenacting. Why don't you write about that as a cultural phenomenon and as a form of narrative? Because you're living something, you're doing something, you're giving it a shape that has meaning and relevance to you, but you hope has meaning and relevance to a historical event. And I thought, okay, well, there's something there. Civil War reenactors are kind of a geeky hobby, It's why do they do it? What satisfaction do they get out of it? What do they hope to accomplish? And what do they want to be saying about America by staging these reenactments? Sometimes for as many as 50,000 spectators, people show up on a humid, hot summer day back east and watch these battles being reenacted. So that storytelling angle of it was interesting to me.
And they always do them at the real places, right?
As close as they can. The National Park Service won't let you reenact on national park land. Mm-hmm. But one Gettysburg thing I did was about a mile and a half away from the border of the Gettysburg National Park, and it was the same kind of landscape. So they try to do that as close to the original spot as possible. Some battle reenactments are done on the actual ground because some battlegrounds haven't been made into parks yet and been preserved. And there's this huge preservation effort involving lots of money to buy lands and set them aside. Some battlefields are forever covered. The Battle of Nashville is covered over with homes, and there's no way you could redo that unless you tore a bunch of houses down, which I don't think is going to happen. It's a very well-to-do south side of the city. But that's part of the same zeal, is to preserve that. But some of them haven't been preserved, and so the owners of the land will say, yeah, go ahead and reenact the battle. And that must feel even weirder to be reenacting a particular attack or maneuver on the same ground the original guys did. If you go visit Gettysburg National Park, you'll find a lot of people, and they mow down the grain the same route that Pickett's charge took across the valley. People will go and walk that route.
Wow.
I think in some way to kind of relive, gee, how long did it take? What were they thinking when they got to this point? What were they feeling when the shells from the Union line started to land and explode? And so I think a lot of people that engage history have the same kind of impulse. They don't go out and spend all the money to get uniforms and reproduction muskets and go sleep on the ground, but it's the same kind of impulse.
So the Civil War was the beginning of our nation defining itself, and by reenacting it, maybe it helps us create a clearer definition. Would that be fair to say? Or
it would be fair to say. it might be more accurate to say that it certainly changed some things permanently about what we were not going to be. And sometimes scholars in the Civil War have ended up wondering, well, what is it we got as a result of the war? Did the winners get what they wanted? Did the losers really give up the things they were supposed to give up? Because race issues and marginalization of black people continued for a full century at least, and some people say is still going on. So some things were solved and some things weren't solved. Robert Penn Warren, poet laureate of the United States, novelist, literary critic, said in a little book he wrote back in 1961 that the American Civil War is the beginning of our sense of a nation, which is kind of strange because, you know, he's kind of neglecting the American Revolution, and we think of, well, that's where we started. But Warren's argument seems to be that a lot of things about our core were not settled until the Civil War happened. And the Civil War was also a great interruption in what people thought was just this long, wonderful progress as a nation, and suddenly we're tearing each other apart for 4 years. Big interruption in a psychic way as well as historical.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in terms of progress, you said the Civil War is still not over. When you first started researching the Civil War, I guess, like, what issues did you see that were not quite resolved about the Civil War, or like what brought you to be interested in studying the Civil War?
Well, that last question is the hardest one. I don't know really what started my interest. My brother gave me a book when I was 9 years old. I didn't have any ancestors that fought in the war, so often Civil War interest is a personal and family thing. With me it isn't, because all my people had gone west before the war started. Some of them were Southerners, some were Northerners. I guess it just seemed like this grand, epic, nation-making moment when what was at stake was very clear. And in historical events, often it's not so very clear. But here it seemed to be. I was curious, for example, when I go to reenactments, finding Vietnam War vets and even some Gulf War vets who participated in reenactment. But my experience has been people who've actually been in battle want nothing to do with war after that. My uncle did not let his kids have toy guns, for example. It was just too much for him. Mm-hmm. But here you have combat veterans who are participating in this kind of pageant theater of reenacting. Mm-hmm. And I'd ask some of them why, and a lot of the answers I got was, I want to participate in something that was meaningful in a war that actually meant something. Vietnam, the whole thing with Vietnam and American culture is we're not sure what it meant or what it was for. And I thought that was interesting, as if they were trying to redefine their sense of what America is and why we should fight for it, because the war they fought in didn't seem to have that. But the Civil War seemed to have meaning.
Do you think that the younger generation is still, like, apt to go out and reenact? I'm from Arizona, and I've never been farther east or south. Like, that is the furthest I've gone. And so, you know, being from there, we don't have that. Like, we don't have any reenactments that I know of. And so...
Oh, but you do.
Oh. I'm missing out again.
When I was active in reenactment, the 23rd New York Infantry, that was the every reenactment unit picks a historical regiment that they imitate. Okay. If there are variations in uniform, they have those, and they do research about the regiment. But they were based in Arizona. I also know there are Indian Wars reenactments done with post-Civil War U.S. cavalry and things like that. And sometimes those guys get hired as extras in movies. I know this happens in Utah also. Yeah. I know some historical reenactment groups that they do Civil War, but they also do frontier wars, and they even will reenact pioneer treks. That got big in Utah some years ago. And now that people have built the wagons and everything and have all the equipment, they say, well, let's do some more, And sometimes a film company hires them to. I know one group that regularly does train robberies on a train called the Heber Creeper that runs from Provo Canyon to Heber. And these guys come on board, and they're authentic down to the barest detail, and they come and rob everybody. And then the good guys come and chase them off, and so.
All right, in our previous meeting, you talked about a story about a widow and about a grave. I don't remember. I forget what it was, but
yeah.
Fill us in?
If we're trying to answer the question of motivation, why do people do reenacting? It's a complicated answer. I thought it was, men wanting to play like boys, playing soldier, playing army, being able to shoot off guns. But you can do that with a lot more comfort and less expense by firing modern guns. And I thought, well, maybe it's theater. And large crowds will show up for these reenactments, but I have known reenactors to do their thing for days at a time with no audience at all. One time I was outside Flagstaff, Arizona with the 23rd New York, and the guys from Utah that I associated with, and we did this running battle for like 3 days, and we just camped on the ground and ate whatever we brought on our haversacks, and there was no audience at all, and everybody derived immense satisfaction for that. So theater with an audience of one, I don't know. One big reenactment I was at, there was a place called Sutler's Row, and sutlers were people who drove wagons and they sold stuff to the soldiers, kind of a traveling pharmacy or drugstore or convenience store. A traveling 7-Eleven, how's that?
All right.
Usually they had to have licenses with the regiment they're attached to. So the sutlers would show up. They're all dressed in authentic 19th century gear, and their products are 19th century products, combs made out of hardwood, and so forth. And I was walking along there looking at things, trying to figure out if I wanted to buy a new muslin shirt. And a woman dressed in black in absolutely magnificent mourner's outfit came up to me, and I'm thinking, okay, I don't know who this is. And she put her hand on my arm and she inquired, she said her husband had been killed in the last battle and she was looking for his regiment. She wanted to claim his body. And she had this story about how she had to leave her 3 children at home with somebody so she could come and get her husband. And I wasn't sure what to say because I didn't have her script. So I did what a 19th century guy would have done. I commented generously on her husband's regiment and its fine reputation and expressed my condolences for her loss and how the satisfaction she must feel knowing that he died fighting for freedom. And she said something in response, and apparently what I said worked for her, and it was fitting in. And then I told her, to my best knowledge, where his regiment might have been, and she thanks me, and off she goes. And I think, boy, that's time travel. And I don't know what she got out of it, because that was a huge black dress, and it was well over 90 degrees in Pennsylvania heat. But she was getting a lot out of it. She was getting that period rush, reenactors call it. Being a widow. So what would it be like to know my husband was killed and have to go find the army to get his body and bring it home? We ran into a photographer who lives in the 19th century. His house has no indoor plumbing or electricity, and the guy goes around with a 19th century video camera taking tintypes at historical events like heritage fairs and battle reenactments. The guy's got a beard. I mean, nothing about him was 20th century. Well, I know it's 21st, but back then it was the 20th. Even his glasses had 19th century rims on them.
Wow.
Maybe he went to see a modern day optometrist, I don't know. But he washed the prints in a wooden bucket, and I'm sitting there thinking, the calendar is the only thing that makes this different from a soldier getting his picture taken back in 1863. So I have that kind of dedication to a period rush. I don't understand. Yeah. Guy lives outside Elmira, New York, in a house that has no central heating. I'm thinking, how do you do that in the winter?
Yeah. Oof.
That's amazing.
It is.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about authenticity on our previous discussion about this. I was wondering if you could go in a little bit about authenticity and the importance to the reenactors of it.
You people who are into the hobby are very big on the details, the authenticity. Namely, you just can't wear polyester or a forage cap with a patent leather bill or something. It's got to be the real thing. And some people have said, well, these guys are really nitpicky. What's the point? Isn't the whole point your imagination? But it's the sensual cues also. You have somebody in the wrong color jacket, it's kind of a jarring thing. Now, here's an old movie for you guys to look up and watch.
All right.
It's called Somewhere in Time.
Somewhere in Time.
I think it was made 1981 or 82. It has Jane Seymour in it and Christopher Reeve. And this playwright, this modern-day playwright, gets obsessed with this actress who was big back in 1912. And he believes that you can travel in time based on something a professor told him. And so he gets clothes made according to 1912. He even gets coins in his pocket and things. And he thinks himself, and suddenly he wakes up in this hotel in 1912. And so he meets her. And it's a very romantic movie. But at some point, they've fallen in love, and she starts criticizing her clothes. She says, really, your suit is 10 years out of fashion. And he says, why? No, it isn't. And he's showing her everything. He goes, look, I even got coins. And he pulls out a penny from his day. And it distracts him so much, he goes, and she loses him. He goes back to his own time. Reenactors feel that way about the sensual cues. You got to have the right kind of tent. You've got to have your musket and all. And you shouldn't be. Now, some reenactors cheat. They'll have, ice chests hidden inside their tents and stuff. But the real faithful ones say, no, you eat hardtack and salt pork and coffee that you grind yourself on the top of a barrel with the butt of the musket, or you even have to parch yourself, roast. Because if you have stuff, you're going to lose your sense of where you are, and you're going to lose a lot of the enjoyment of being in the period, being in character. That's another thing. Some of them say if you talk about your everyday, modern-day stuff while you're in a reenactment, you're ruining it for other people. You're supposed to stay in character. I'm Private Jeremiah Olson of the 11th Minnesota, and so that's who I'm going to be. A lot of people find it hard to focus on that, but a lot of reenactors get their enjoyment out of the idea that I really am in 1862, and there's nothing else going on that would jar that, until a jet from Dulles Airport flies over, and then kind of breaks the spell, as it did at one reenactment I was in. And so the people who organize these events try to find wide open spaces without telephone wires and asphalt roads.
And they even have terminology, right? A farb.
Oh, yes.
Can you explain to...
A farb is what you must not be.
Yes.
First of all, you criticize somebody if their gear isn't authentic by saying it's not period. And if it's not period...
Very snobby.
Yes. It's very snobbish. And one critic said... I've only seen gay people in the fashion industry who are that concerned about the thread count. So thread counters has become a word reenactors use for people who are too nitpicky about the details. How many threads per linear inch do you have here? A farb is somebody who's not authentic. Really can't find out the root of the word. Some people said, it started back in the 1960s when people started doing reenacting, and somebody would come up and say, far be it from me to criticize, but your, shoes are not authentic. And these guys were just wearing gray work shirts and cowboy hats. They didn't look like Civil War soldiers at all back in those days. But I can't find any real evidence that farb came from that. So nobody's able to find it. It's gone into other fields now. I hear people using farb for anybody who's a phony or not doing it right.
Okay. Cool.
But it was born in
Civil War Reenactment. that we can verify.
Good.
So who is, keeping track of all the things that people find? Because of, if people view themselves as living historians, where is that knowledge going?
Where's the knowledge going?
Or the discoveries that people make of the period?
Okay, there are some publications. There's a magazine called the Camp Chase Gazette and others, where people in reenacting will talk about new discoveries they've made. Look, a museum in Tennessee, we found this kind of fabric being used for regimental uniforms. These are state-issued uniforms and not uniforms commissioned by the individual regiments. Or they'll say these are from the Richmond Depot, in which case the Confederate government was making uniforms for everybody for a while. And it's not just the men, the women have really gotten into it, especially women who are interested in historical costuming. And they do research and find out, well, this fabric was available because women were using it in their clothes, and it was a common thing. For instance, they discovered the reason the Confederacy chose gray as their uniform color isn't because anybody liked gray. It was just the single most common color in civilian fabrics, and therefore it was available. And and then after a while they ran out of gray cloth and gray dye. The South didn't have many industries, and so people started making homemade dyes that turned out more of a kind of a brown color. They called it butternut. And I read things about, and a lot of this is discovered by different kinds of living history, but they'd find writings where people used rust and walnut husks, not the shells, but the husk around the walnut, to make a dye, a butternut colored dye. And so people would experiment with it, and they say, oh yeah, it works, and it looks like the one we found here in the museum, or at least in the seams, the fading happens. And there's a million places people can go, and they've gone there. What kind of wool was available? What color blue was it really? For a while, one company that makes reproduction uniforms, they're called C&D Jarnigan down in Mississippi. They were making Union uniforms, dark blue, but sewn with brown thread, because every uniform they found at the Smithsonian had brown thread in it. But then after a while they changed that because they discovered the thread was cotton thread, and the dye used in the cotton thread would change color from dark blue to brown, so the new uniforms were sewn with blue thread. And so they stopped making the uniforms with brown thread. More discoveries, shoes, where food was made and how it was made, because different companies would contract with the government to make hardtack, the hard square biscuit that was the mainstay of the Union soldiers' diet. Very simple recipe: flour, salt, and water.
Delicious and nutritious.
Teeth dullers, they call them, or sheet iron sometimes.
They look so gross online. I looked it up, and it looks terrible.
Well, it's amazing how good they taste when you're hungry.
Yeah, I suppose.
Hunger's the best sauce.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. And weapons, they do research on the regiments, and they think, well, 58 caliber Springfield rifle was the standard for the U.S. Army, so we figure this regiment had it. And then somebody's research shows, no, in fact, they're using a shorter barrel Austrian rifle because it was all that was available. And so everybody in the unit says, well, we're either got to change the name of our unit or get the Austrian rifles. There are companies that make reproductions of these muskets, and so they're available. One group I was in said my musket didn't look right. It was an Enfield, a British-made Enfield, but they said, you're in the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Army didn't allow bluing on the barrel of the gun, so you've got to sand your bluing off. So the barrel's bright, regulation bright, they called it.
Wow.
So I took the bluing off of my barrel and the barrel bands too, and it looked a lot different. It also rusts more easily, but it looks authentic, by golly.
Very
Do it or you're a
authentic.
farb.
Yeah.
That's right. I didn't want to be a farb. I didn't want anybody to think I was a farb.
Is there anything that they just can't recreate, or that they don't? Like, what is lost in the
killing
reenactment?
people probably, hopefully, is not
Wounds and
recreated.
death.
Wounds and death.
You're right. Sorry, guys.
There's a book by a well-known journalist named Tony Horowitz, who he used to be a reporter for the Washington Post and the New York Times during the Gulf War and early in the Iraq War, but he's been writing books mostly about history as it meets popular culture. He wrote one about Captain Cook not too long ago. He wrote one about Captain Cook's influence in the Pacific, and he wrote one about Columbus. But he wrote one called Confederates in the Attic, and he was looking at how the Civil War still lives on, especially in the southern states. And he ran into this reenactment group, and these guys called themselves hardcores. And there is a division amongst reenactors. Some people who are hardcores scorn the others as farbs, and the others say hardcores are just nuts. You can't. Hardcores will not bathe for weeks before a reenactment, so they'll smell right. Now, the people at wherever they work probably object to that. the guy urinates on his brass buttons so they'll look the right way. It gives them a tarnish. And these guys would sleep on the ground. They'd literally steal chickens and cook them and eat them, and that would be the rations.
Oh.
When the hardcores would show up at a battle reenactment for what they call a tactical, where they're actually going to stage a battle, these guys would refuse to participate. And Tony says, well, why? This is a battle. This is what reenactors do. They said, it's not authentic because there are no bullets.
Oh.
And we don't want to do any, we don't want to, I guess they felt like they'd be lowering themselves if they did something that wasn't authentic. And since you really can't reproduce battles with bullets and come out of it alive, they just would not participate in the tactical. They do the marching and the camping and the suffering.
Oh my goodness.
And to a lot of reenactors, well, that's the whole point, is for the fun of a battle and to be able to shoot off your gun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what's the point? Like, why do people do that if they're not going to be a part of the battles? Like, it is the Civil War, after all.
It's they want to live the life of the soldier. And if I'm going to do a tactical and we're just using blanks, I won't feel the same stress and terror the Civil War soldier did, and therefore it would break the mood. It wouldn't be as satisfying to me.
Have you come into contact with these people? Have you?
I wrote one of them a letter, and I never got any answer back. I asked them some questions while I was writing my article, but I didn't get anything back from them.
Maybe because it wasn't on the right type of parchment.
It may have been.
The carrier pigeon got lost.
This guy had a long, bushy black beard, and I can't remember who he actually had a job with, but he'd write articles for the Camp Chase Gazette and some other things. And people criticize, and some of them are hardcores, when they see a reenactment and they notice the guys reenacting the soldiers are a bit overweight, like me, and a bit demographically incorrect. You know, I've got this white hair here because most Civil War soldiers between the age of 17 and 24, about 85% of them were in that age group. And so you get a bunch of older looking guys and they're in it because they enjoy it. But if we're talking about authenticity, buddy, you need to drop about 40 pounds, look a little more starved. There were no portly people in Civil War infantry regiments. They did too much walking. And so a lot of hardcores will say we shouldn't have allowed them in. You know, we should only allow them in. Oh, and women. Should I talk about women?
Sure, absolutely.
There's an issue about whether a woman could do reenacting. There's a woman named Lauren Burgess, and she was a doctoral student in history at some university. But she loved the Civil War, and she would come to reenactments. And she's kind of tall and thin, and it worked okay, but she came to one reenactment and she was registering. The guy says, sorry, you can't register. She says, why? He says, well, you're female. You're not authentic. You didn't have women in the Army. And she says, what difference does it make as long as if I'm dressed in my uniform, you can't tell? And she was pretty mad about that. And she started doing some more research and changed the whole course of her dissertation. She started doing research and started finding out many women who were in the ranks, some undetected, like she planned to be. But some of them were in the Army, and the guys in her unit knew that she was female. In some cases, she was the wife of one of the soldiers. In a lot of cases, they kept their identity secret for years and years. One woman received a pension for 30 years before she finally revealed she was a woman.
Wow.
And
smart.
Got the pension.
It was strange. And then sometimes there were the wives of soldiers, and there used to be a sappy song in the late 60s called "The Cruel War." The cruel war is raging and Johnny has to go. And the woman singing the song says, I want to go with him. And he keeps saying no, but in the last verse he says yes. Well, why would you want to go to war? But they did. Among the Confederate dead on the slopes of Cemetery Ridge after the Battle of Gettysburg was found a Confederate soldier and his wife, who were both in the same company, who'd both been killed on the slopes of that ridge. So Lauren Burgess found this out, and she filed a lawsuit against the reenactment group.
Wow.
And she says, women are authentic, and you ought to let us in because they actually were in the combat units. I remember reading one journal, and the guy says, Lieutenant, in our regiment was delivered of a bouncing baby boy last week.
Wow.
Nobody knew she was female until then.
Just hit it really well.
Yeah, did they not know she was pregnant either? Like for 9 months?
She must have had a really baggy uniform. I don't know.
Yeah, wow.
But it was, so she won her lawsuit. She didn't claim big damages or money, but she wanted to make a point. She ended up coming out with a book that talked about women soldiers. And so that's caused kind of a crisis in reenacting. Do we let women into our group or not? And I've seen some reenactment group that have women. One group I saw was very strange because the women made absolutely no effort to hide their gender. Ponytails, tight-fitting uniforms, and just, you couldn't ignore it. And I think I don't think that was the
Farbs,
point.
all of them.
Yeah, farbs. Yeah, they were farbs. Very often the women in the actual war would be outed as soon as they were, like if they got wounded. And the doctor says, whoops,
So I notice you are female.
You're female. Ooh.
Might have been a shock to some of them. So yeah, the issue of authenticity is a difficult one because, and a lot of it depends on what you're trying to achieve, what kind of effect you're trying to achieve, and what you're in it for.
Yeah, I had a question about that.
Yeah.
So you're saying some people want to reshape the past, or you're saying negotiating the past. So who's championing that? And then also, it seems like to me that this striving for authenticity is like moving away from reshaping the past. So I guess how do you balance authenticity and then reshaping the past?
Okay, that's a good question. If you go into reenacting because you want to relive the past, you'd probably be pretty passionate about authenticity, at least the authenticity that matters to you. And some people take it down to the very underwear they wear. To me, I figured, look, everything that's visual is what's important. And so I would let my beard grow for a week or so before, because most soldiers on campaign didn't take time to shave. Oh, it's amazing how many did, Find a shiny bottom of a pot and get their razor and shave out in the field. I just can't imagine that cold water, no soap. But that's an important thing to them. But in that kind of environment, it's a strange thing. You feel like you're there. You're living the same kind of life. You got the smell of smoke in your clothes and your hair, and you're feeling pretty grubby. And the chiggers are biting you, and the fleas are getting you. And the spiders. Last time I went, I had a whole bunch of spiders under my blanket when I pulled it up.
Oh my gosh.
Like, I am not a farb.
I am not a farb. I've lived it.
And in that kind of environment, especially when you're staging a historical battle, it feels like, well, I'm there. I can actually change history. History becomes a very flexible and malleable thing. So in an article I wrote, I talked about a reenactment at Gettysburg, the 125th anniversary.
I loved that story.
Where a bunch of Southern guys said, we're going to make a pact. We're not going to follow the script and fall down when the Yankees fire at us. We're going to keep charging and break the line and win the battle. And they couldn't do it. I was talking to one of these guys afterwards. And he says, well, we couldn't get close enough. Just the force of those muskets firing blanks. Now, they're dangerous enough. You're burning black powder. But that was enough just to knock us down. We couldn't even get close. He says, so history repeated itself. And blankety blank blank, He said, well, maybe the South will win the Battle of Gettysburg next time we try it.
Next time.
But you get that kind of feeling, if I'm in this, then I'm doing it. And if I'm doing it, then what I do becomes history. It's an illusion, of course, but some people would argue all history is an illusion. All history is merely rhetoric. It's, everybody's got an agenda.
So why is that, I guess, that illusion? Why is that important for people to reenact or recreate or do over and over and over again?
Still trying to figure that out.
Work in progress.
With a lot of them, they figure this is America's Homeric age, and I want to be part of it because it will. If I learn the suffering they went through and maybe vicariously at least feel the fear they felt, and then maybe that will make me more of an American, and I will understand better what this country means, because right now I don't understand it from my distance. Mm-hmm. Why would people, and these are mostly volunteer armies, and the casualty rates were horrific. More Americans killed in this war than all the rest of America's wars put together.
Wow.
And at the first, both sides couldn't figure out, why would they want to fight us just to keep us in the country? On the other hand, why would they want to fight us just so they could leave the country? We don't see the point. Mm-hmm. And so I guess to understand that problem, which is still a complex and thorny problem, they say, well, maybe if I participate, I'll know how it is. And I'm not sure I answered your question.
That's okay. Still interesting.
So, and it's more about just, it's more than playing Army. I thought, okay, a bunch of grown-ups want to fire off guns. We've known for a long time big boys like to play with toys, okay? But why the reenactors actually relished the suffering was a peculiar thing to me. Because I thought, I'd just as soon go to a motel every night. Mm-hmm. But I want to sleep out there in where the temperature doesn't go any lower than 96 even at night, and the fleas and the discomfort. And my brother, in one reenactment, we got killed. It was pretty clear we got killed because we were sent to the wrong place. And we fell down, and the Confederates advanced over us, and they were stepping on us. And one guy went down and rifled through my brother's haversack to steal stuff. And later he says, that was great. It was like we were just real dead guys, and those are real rebels.
Real dead guys.
And I told them if they were real rebels, they would have taken your shoes.
Yeah.
But they actually revel in the discomfort. One night we started to sing. My brother and I and my cousin, we grew up singing together, and we started singing Civil War songs, the three harmonies, around a campfire. This was the last night of the event. And we got done with a couple of songs and looked around, and instead of just a dozen guys that we started with, there were like 40 gathered around there.
Wow.
And one guy wipes a tear away, and he says, "This is what I came for." And we said, "What, the music?" He said, No, this feeling of being here, being lonely and far away from home, and singing with fellow soldiers. And I don't know, maybe we feel separated from each other, and we miss the kind of camaraderie that we feel was more of society in the past. Mm-hmm. The Civil War regiments weren't raised like modern U.S. Army units are. They all the guys in your company you knew. They come from your neighborhood or your town. All the guys in your regiment came from your county. And you already had kind of a built-in camaraderie and kind of a feeling that we all have stake in this group. And that's good for morale, and some people in the modern Army say we ought to do that again, and others say no, it's better to mix them up. But
Wow. Well, thank you for coming on this podcast and letting us question you about your work, and it's really interesting, so thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks for tuning in. This was the Xeno Podcast. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Xeno Podcast.
That's Xeno Podcast. If you have any questions or comments about what we talked about today, or suggestions for future episodes, you can email us at podcastzeno@gmail.com.
This podcast was brought to you by BYU Hawaii's Reading and Writing Center.
We'll be back next time with more of the look through the nooks and crannies of stories and our consciousness and our history.
Thanks for learning by listening.